Voice of FinTech.
Hello and welcome to Voice of FinTech Africa series. I'm Rudy Fala, the founder of Voice of FinTech podcast. In this series, you will hear inspirational stories of entrepreneurs, investors, incumbents, and ecosystem hub leaders from Africa. And this episode is hosted by Stacey.
Welcome to Voice of FinTech. I'm Stacey Japhta, and today I'll be chatting with Buhle Goslar, Africa's CEO of Jumo. Jumo was founded in 2015 and is dedicated to building and operating a financial services platform for people who have limited or no access to finance. Using advanced data science and machine learning, Jumo creates savings and credit products for entrepreneurs in emerging markets, as well as a financial services infrastructure for partners such as telcos and banks. In just over 5 years of operation, Jumo has dispersed more than $2.5 billion in loans and served over 17 million customers and small businesses. They are active in 6 markets, including Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and most recently, Cote d'Ivoire. In this episode, Buhle and I touch upon being an entrepreneur at a really young age, building business units from the ground up. We dive really deep into Buhle's MBA paper that touches on gender diversity and why we're not seeing the full benefits of financial inclusion in South Africa. Then we take a dive into pay equity and how we have to move away from pay secrecy. Hi, Buhle. Morning.
Morning.
How are you today?
So lovely to be here. I'm doing really well.
Have you're up early. It sounds like you're an early riser.
I am, not by design. I have become one out of necessity. Yeah.
I remember when we were planning this podcast, you were like, how early is early for you? And I was like,
Yeah.
What time's your average wake up?
So I'm actually trying to get about 7 to 8 hours of sleep at the moment.
Okay.
So I'm waking up slightly later, around 5:30 or 5:45.
That's later.
Yeah.
I don't want to know what earlier is.
Earlier is just sleepless nights, thinking about all the things that can go wrong with whatever launch you're working on.
Sounds like a dream. Well, awesome. Well, I'm really excited to learn about your journey and essentially what led you to become Africa's CEO of Jumo World.
Great. So I think for me, right from the beginning, I've always been interested in how things can fit together, how you build things. And that hasn't necessarily always been in financial services. I actually had my start working for a travel tech company before we actually called it travel tech. And really what we were trying to do was make travel more available to the man on the street. But also what we wanted to do was to make the opportunity, the business opportunity of travel available to more SMEs across Africa, right? And that was just a fantastic opportunity to understand an industry and a system, who gets included, who gets left behind. And I became incredibly passionate about that. I became passionate about helping young graduates enter the industry and build careers. So people from previously disadvantaged backgrounds. And I just kind of grew from there. And I think in the second phase of my career, I then moved on to financial services. And I was surprised actually to see how we had so many of the same problems where products were not being designed for the many, right, and needed to be adapted. And it's not just about shrinking the product, right? It's about understanding what those customers need. So it was exactly the same issue that we had faced in tourism. Like, how do you make it available to the man on the street?
Yeah.
Well, you have to change the product. Also realizing that just like in tourism, when it comes to the actual business and who makes money from that business, it was also exclusive, right? And so really thinking about how you allow more people to participate and unlock more opportunities. And one of the things which was obviously a common thread in both of these industries that I worked in was technology and what that can do. The second thing that they all had in common was the importance of having the right data in order to shape the product correctly, right? Whether it's pricing it, where to distribute it, how to distribute it, information was so critical.
Yeah.
The last thing was about capital, right? Because, he who has the capital makes the rules. And so if, small businesses don't have capital or, startups, you have to think very innovatively to access the right capital at the right cost in order to be able to participate. And so, as I became more interested in kind of the more systemic challenges of financial services, I think the natural transition for me was to move from the bigger corporate banking and retail financial services environment into a startup. And I actually met Andrew Watkins-Buhle, who's the group CEO of Jumo, quite by accident. As I was going through this exploration, I was doing my MBA dissertation on the issue of financial inclusion. And Jumo was one of the companies that I was interviewing, and some of the people that I met there were very eager that I meet him for a coffee and just a chat. And that evolved into him saying, you've got to join us. This is, I think that our thinking around the customer and where we need to take financial services on the continent is super aligned. And that's really how I joined Jumo and started to build my career there.
That's awesome. That happened by chance and everything happens in such a funny way. We were chatting last week about the different units you build throughout your career and throughout different businesses. You learned about being an entrepreneur at the age of 23 when you built the business division in China from scratch with your travel tech business. It seems that the theme throughout your career has been building units from the ground up. What are the steps you take to see these units succeed?
That's true. That's definitely been a theme in my career. I think that, it starts with first recognizing that there is a gap that needs to be filled, right? And that it is a gap that's large enough, right? That there's a big enough problem to solve, and that it is something that will have longevity and continued benefit. I suppose it is often when you're building units within a business, it's a form of intrapreneurship, right? So you have to think about, what is the value that this will create for this organization in the long term, because you have to sell it. And when I was 23 and I went to the founder of the travel tech company that I worked for, he is a French guy, and he was kind of like, what do you want to do? And I said, there is this emerging opportunity in China. We had predominantly been operating in Europe at the time. I did have a Japan portfolio already. So what I wanted to do was to expand that to cover more of Asia. I had my numbers, but I think with any opportunity, you've got to show that you're leaning into an opportunity with large numbers, right? And I had a very clear business case. So I think that's the first thing. Then I think the second thing is being able to show that you have the ability to bring in the right skills and capabilities to attack that opportunity. And, I had actually identified some Mandarin-speaking consultants who could join my team. So I had really done my homework around how this would work. I had reached out to a couple of the wholesale tourism companies. I had connected with the South African tourism agency as well. And so with anything, you have to show that this is not just kind of a pie in the sky idea.
Yeah, a lot of research backed up.
Exactly. It needs to feel real to whoever you're selling it to, right? And I think that's important. But I think the other thing that you always need to think very carefully about, just like in building a business, is you need to have thought about whether the necessary conditions for the unit that you're building exist in that organization, right? Because otherwise you will face a transplant rejection when you kind of bring this in. And so I think in the context of building the China unit, I knew that our organization had a track record of being willing to try new things, even if they fail, and that it was accepted as a part of innovating, And I also knew that, the incentive structure, lent itself to being able to build a team. It would be attractive for people to leave different roles and join this mission. I knew that the way in which we designed our products and negotiated our commercials allowed a level of flexibility, which going into a market like China would be necessary. So I think those are some of the things that you need to think really, really carefully about when you build a unit within a business. And I think the last thing I would say is you need to know that launching it and starting is truly just the beginning. A lot of the real work will begin after you've launched, where you have to make sure stakeholders remain supportive, share all of the wins, be transparent as well around what's not going well. That gives people a lot of comfort that nothing is being hidden. And I think, and I've done this a couple of times, right? Post that I did it, building a new marketing unit in retail financial services and many different units within Jumo. And truly for me, I think that is a formula that is proven and which certainly I have refined and found super useful over the years.
Did you have a mentor throughout this? Because you were taking on a beast, you were young, you had never done this before. How did you tackle that?
In the first opportunity with the China business, I actually didn't have a mentor, certainly not in a formal way that we talk about it.
Okay.
But I'll tell you what, one thing I've always had is a really strong network of people around me. And, we used to have like a young professionals club that used to meet at our apartment, and we would and we would share things that were happening to us in our various workplaces. And we were all doing very, very different things. So bringing a huge diversity of experience. Some of my friends were in consulting, so working for the big four consulting firms. Some were in advertising, some were in banking. And so really when we came together, I think that we essentially created just an incredible resource for ourselves without even having mentors per se.
Awesome. In the beginning of this conversation, you touched on your MBA paper, and the topic that you touched on, I think, is so interesting. First of all, my team hosted a clubhouse room surrounding the topic, is there a new unicorn coming to Africa? And many participants mentioned they don't want to see a Western fintech come into the African market and dominate, but would rather see an African-born payments business thrive. Buhle, we chatted about your MBA paper touching on why we're not seeing the full benefits of financial inclusion in South Africa and how this ties into the emerging markets not creating innovative products. This is a loaded question, but what is the reason for this and how do we solve it? Can we solve it?
Yeah. I'm going to try to be brief.
Okay.
So I am an optimist. So, my answer to that will be yes, we can solve it. I think I have just a kind of bottomless belief in the ingenuity on this continent and in South Africa as well. So I believe we can solve it. But I think what that will take is us really facing up to what the challenges are, right? And we spoke, earlier on in this conversation around capital.
Yeah.
He who has the capital or she who has the capital, makes the rules. And I think that unless we can solve the issue of access to capital in order to build, this will remain a problem. And I think a lot has actually been said in the African tech ecosystem around this: who gets funded, who gets the best terms, and why. So that is something that we have to address head on, right? And then I think the other thing that we need to look at is whether companies can actually get startups, that is, can actually get a chance to grow to unicorn status.
Yeah.
In the South African context in particular, one of the things that was quite interesting in my research was that we could see this acquisition trail. So most of the businesses that really had good product market fit and gained reasonable momentum were typically acquired by the banks. Now, this in and of itself is not a bad thing. But what I did is I actually also interviewed some of these startups that had been acquired to understand what changed about them post that, right? Because I was also looking at their product development cycle, even just how their communication and things like that changed post acquisition. And, one of the things that became apparent was that it was quite difficult to maintain that innovative culture post-acquisition. And so some of the ideas I toyed around with in my dissertation was that because capital is so important and being well-funded is so important, perhaps different structures need to be explored in terms of how these businesses are kind of absorbed into the larger structures. So that was one thing.
Okay.
Then the second thing is around barriers to entry, right? And I think, regulation is absolutely necessary, and I'm a huge fan, right?
Yeah.
Because consumers need to be protected. But I think that it's a really challenging space because sometimes what happens is in trying to protect and empower the end consumer, regulation can introduce very high costs of compliance. Right now, these can be in the form of licensing or just all of the different things that a company is required to do in order to fully comply and participate in a highly regulated space, which typically anything to do with finance, technology, and processing of information is, right? So unfortunately, what that means is that there are very few players that can actually scale those hurdles and, just get a ticket to the game in the first place. And I think that what we've seen is that in other African countries, the regulators have been quite progressive here, whether it's by creating sandboxes or saying that, we'll allow you to innovate for a while and then regulate when we have a better understanding of what is actually happening, right? And I think that's something which is really important. And the last kind of theme, which I think is worth exploring here, is one that is about diversity, right? And I think that when you don't have diversity and variety, you just are not really setting yourself up for a system that can scale and that will foster the growth of future unicorns, right? So you have to create the conditions that allow for this diversity in terms of who gets to participate. And that means, really being open to some of the leaders coming from slightly different backgrounds in terms of their skills. So, not necessarily everyone having a classical banking background, for instance, in financial services. And I think that's more of a social thing. And but I think that shift does definitely need to happen.
Diversity is a topic we can both talk about for hours. Moving towards a more controversial topic, focusing on gender diversity and pay equity, how do we move away from pay secrecy?
So I think the first thing with this kind of shroud of secrecy that surrounds remuneration is we need to get people to buy into the benefits of transparency, right? And I think, whenever I've spoken about this topic, I can see people visibly get uncomfortable. Like, what do you mean? Like, you mean everybody's salary? And one of the questions I always ask is, who stands to gain by us hiding what the remuneration structure in any organization is? Right. And actually, I think the benefits by far outweigh the negatives here. But one of the things I've actually observed is that I think the root of this issue really comes from our discomfort as a society in talking about money, especially as it relates to personal finance. And I think that this is a discomfort and a shame that actually needs to be eradicated, because far beyond just issues of pay inequality, it hurts us in every sphere, right?
Yes.
When you talk about things like over-indebtedness, right, that comes from, again, a secrecy and not talking about what can I truly afford. When you talk about the impending retirement crisis, for us here in Africa, because we have a very young population, but we are starting to, to see some people getting into retirement age who have no plan.
Yes.
And it's because we haven't spoken about that.
There's no education around it as well. Like, I am fortunate to have people surrounding me being like, Stacey, you need to have a retirement annuity. You should have started at 16. But who's helping us in this?
Exactly. But what's worse, right, is that for some people, they think, okay, great, let me get a retirement policy. But again, we're not talking about money deeply enough. So we don't talk about what is a wise investment strategy, right?
Exactly.
Have you looked at, your total effective rate that you're paying on your investments, or are they just being eroded by some investment banker that's driving around in a fancy car? And for us to get to those truly important conversations that will help us build and transfer wealth and close the gap where there's inequality, we need to stop treating money like it's a taboo subject, because it's not. It's very, very simple as far as I'm concerned. We wake up, we go to work, whether it's an entrepreneurial endeavor or for a company. We exchange our life energy for money, and we want to make sure that it is a fair exchange, right? So let's put it on the table: equal work, equal pay, because you have one life, and every hour you give you cannot get it back. It is too precious for us to, kind of tread like on eggshells around this issue.
Yeah.
So for me, I think it's very much about us understanding that this is not a shameful topic, that if we bring it into the light, we stand to benefit more than we stand to lose, and that in fact, this will create the platform for us to tackle so many other money issues that are truly standing between us and being able to to achieve financial freedom first, then to build wealth, and then to transfer wealth to future generations, right?
Yeah.
Because that is really what we need on this continent. We need to not only create wealth, but we need to create it in a way that we're able to pass it on to future generations.
I remember in my first job, I was paid 20% less than another male at the same level as me, and I was a higher performer looking at KPIs. And this was just a conversation we never had. I was just so confused how we could even position it this way. But then I went back to it and thought, okay, this was a salary I asked for. So there's also a lack of education on that side. Is how do we know what to ask for going into our first job? Because once we are at a certain level or at a certain income bracket, it's hard to grow faster, because when you go into your next position, they always ask for your previous payslip. What do you think of this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is that tendency to kind of peg it to your last job. So I spoke earlier on about how when I was kind of starting out my career, we had, this network of friends and kind of a mentorship circle, as it were. And one of the things, thinking back, I didn't think much of it at the time, but we spoke about money, we spoke about what we wanted to target and about the offers. And so what happened with that was that I actually started to get a really good sense of pay per sector, really understand, if I had friends who worked in FMCG and they would go, if I move from assistant brand manager to brand manager, this is what happens, etc. And they would share that. And that was incredibly helpful. And in fact, my part of my decision, to move from tourism to the financial services sector was just looking at what my income trajectory would look like, right?
Yeah.
And I had a really good sense of that because we were having those conversations. So I think that's another resource that, you really can use in order to benchmark and ask for, what you're worth, and certainly what that job should be paying. I think there are starting to be more resources that kind of scour, each sector to understand what the salary ranges look like. I still think there's insufficient information as far as that's concerned, but at least it's moving slowly in the right direction.
Buhle, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really, really enjoyed chatting with you.
It's been an absolute pleasure and talking about all of my favorite things. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Where's the best place for listeners to reach you?
Best place is on LinkedIn. I am on there quite regularly, and I'm also on Twitter at Buhle Goslar.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Voice of FinTech podcast. If you haven't already, check out also voiceoffintech.com, where you will find all the episodes and additional resources related to the podcast. You can also subscribe to Voice of FinTech on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or any other podcast app that you like. If you have any suggestions on the topics or guests, or how to make this podcast better for you, please email us at info@voiceoffintech.com. Happy to hear from you.